Hello and welcome to another IELTS video. If you are new here, my name is Brahim and my goal is to help you get a high band in IELTS of 7 or more fast in the shortest time possible. And to do that, today in this video, I am going to teach you 5 advanced words that you could use throughout the IELTS speaking test, or what I actually prefer to call sophisticated words, because these words I carefully selected so you could use them in any parts of the test, because usually if you Google advanced words for IELTS, you'll probably come across words like ubiquitous, plethora, perspicacious, and so on. And the problem is these words are too cliche, which means that the examiner will know that you're just trying hard to sound advanced and your level might not really be there. And the other problem is you might end up using them in the wrong context, because most of these words are not really used in everyday English. So what I'm going to teach you today is very few, only 5 words, and I believe that's all you need. I don't have to bombard you with endless list of 70 or 80, because I believe that if you only learn these 5 words, it's more than enough for today. So if we start with the very first word, which is overlook, and this is actually a C2 word. And what it essentially means, well, it has 2 meanings, but let's focus on the first meaning for now. And the first meaning is you fail to notice or consider something. So, for example, in part 1, let's say you are talking about your daily routine, whether it is related to work or studies. I am pretty sure that most of us send emails on a daily basis. So an example could be, I once overlooked a small detail in an email sent to my professor, which was quite embarrassing. And it means that you didn't pay attention to some detail there. Maybe you sent the wrong link, or you uploaded the wrong attachment, the wrong file, or something like that. If we move to part 2, if you get asked a question that's perhaps related to describing a trip or traveling to a destination. So an example could be, I once traveled to the mountains with my friend, and although it was the summertime, we overlooked the fact that it gets cold at night, so we ended up freezing, and you didn't pack the right clothes for that. Another example where you could use it, also related to traveling, let's say you were traveling and then you had to book some rooms in a hostel, for example. So when you are describing a trip, you could say, I once traveled with my friend, we booked the rooms in a hostel. However, when we arrived there, we were not allowed to check in because it turned out that I overlooked the fact that it was girls' room only. In some hostels, they might have some dormitories or sleeping rooms where it is either only for guys or girls. So you need to pay attention to those little details. And since we are talking about hotels, that actually brings us to the second meaning of this word, which means to provide a view, especially from above. So let's say you booked a room like really high up in the building, and you get a nice view of the beach. So you could say our room overlooked the beach. And by the way, I compiled all these advanced words with the examples that I am covering today in one single PDF document that is available for you to download it for free. I also added visuals that could help you understand or remember the meaning, so please go ahead and check the link down below. Now in part 3, one way how you could use overlook is if you get a question that's asking you, let's say within the health and fitness or well-being topic. One question that you might get in part 3 is, do you think that people value their health enough? So you could answer it by saying, not really. I think that most people overlook their health until they face a serious problem or a health issue. And that's usually the case. People don't really exercise or follow a strict diet until they go see a doctor, and then they tell them that there is some serious health issue there, whether their cholesterol levels are high or blood pressure is getting high, and then only after that they start paying attention. So we say they overlook their health, which means they ignore it. Now this brings us to the second word, which is intrinsic. And this is actually a C2 word as well. And what it means that something is a very basic characteristic of something or someone, but at the same time, it is extremely important. So let me give you an example. In part 1, if you get asked about your hobbies or interests, for example, you could say, I am an intrinsically curious person, so I've literally tried so many hobbies as a child. And then you come to, like, you say, after you tried so many of them, which one you found the most interesting. So the expression we used here, I am an intrinsically curious person. So it means by nature, you are always curious to try so many things. You're always like open to try different hobbies, or you always want to learn more or like expand your skills. Another way also in part 1, when you're talking about your hometown or your family, and within that context, you could say, growing up in a family of doctors, reading was an intrinsic part of my upbringing. So because your parents valued education a lot, they taught you to read a lot. This is even if you get asked whether you enjoy reading books. You could also answer it with this one. You can just adapt it also to the situation. It doesn't have to be that your parents are doctors. You could say, growing up in a family of farmers, hard work was an intrinsic part of our values. In part 2, if you get a cue card that's asking you to describe a person, one way how you could use it is that you talk about the person, and then when you are describing them, you could say, generosity was an intrinsic trait of his personality, of who he was. And it means that someone by nature, or they've always been generous, whether it's your grandfather or like whoever you're talking about, it means that they value that trait a lot. It's just part of who they are, and it's extremely important to them. Now, if we get to part 3, most of the time you might get asked about some really advanced questions that's asking you whether you see autonomous cars in the future, or do you believe that people will start using digital currencies instead of real money, or do you think that AI is gonna change many aspects of our lives? So most of these advancements in technology, they're going to bring change. It doesn't matter what the topic is. You could always start your answer by saying people are intrinsically resistant to change, and then you go on and like expand on the topic. Moving to the third word, which is virtually. Virtually means almost or nearly. So in part 1, if you get asked about your hobbies again or your interest, you could say, growing up, I virtually tried every hobby before I discovered my passion for photography, for example. And it means that you tried almost everything before you realized that you enjoy photography or whatever your hobby is. In part 2, if you ask to describe an object, your phone is probably the easiest thing that you could describe. So you could say, nowadays I rely on my phone for virtually everything. You could also say, it is virtually impossible to function without my phone. In part 3, the examiner might ask you, do you think that technology is important in our society today? So you could answer it by saying, definitely. These days, virtually everything relies on technology, from work to education to keeping in touch with friends. Now, having learned that, please be careful or bear in mind that there is a second meaning to the word virtually. And the second meaning, when we say something is virtual, it means it doesn't physically exist. It exists on the web, on the internet, or it can be accessed through a computer. Now this brings us to the fourth word, which is daunting. And what daunting means, it means that it requires a lot of work, overwhelming, or it makes you worried or afraid that you might not be able to do all the work that's required to do that. So in part 1, when you get asked about your interest or hobbies, or what you do in your spare time, you could say that I've recently started learning French. It seemed quite daunting at first, but it's getting easier. And it means that you found it too difficult at first, or you realize that you're gonna have to put a lot of time and effort memorizing so many different things, but then over time it's getting easier. When you are memorizing these words, you need to strategically plan how you're gonna use them during the exam. You need to be able to predict the questions, but we all know what topics you're gonna get asked about. So you need to strategically plan in advance how you're going to use it depending on the topic of the question that you're going to get. In part 2 of the IELTS speaking test, you might get a cue card that's asking you to describe a business idea. So one way how you could answer that is you could say, I've always wanted to start my own cafe. You could say a cat cafe. But the idea of managing everything and starting the whole business seems daunting. It means that it's a lot of work, and to be honest, it's a lot of work to start a business, and that's why not many people do that. In part 3 of the IELTS speaking test, you might get a question from the examiner that's asking you whether you think public speaking is an important skill in a leader, or something like that. So you could answer it by saying, absolutely, I totally agree that public speaking is an important skill, but many people find it daunting, and that's why very few leaders excel at it. So if you have not yet got the meaning of the word daunting, I'll try to put it in a context that is perhaps more understandable for you because it applies to your situation. So let's say you are preparing for your IELTS test, and then you Google what are the most common topics for part 1, for example, and then you end up seeing a list like this one. So if you try to learn or cover a vocabulary that's related to every single topic there, that's going to be daunting because you're going to have to memorize so many words, and this list is so long. Another smart way how you could prepare instead is to try and categorize all these different topics. So you put them in under some different topics, and then that could, you might end up with a table of only 4 main topics, listing all these subtopics within those, and then you could prepare some advanced or flexible words that can be used related to each one of these 4 main topics. And then if you practice these words well enough and you are confident enough to not mess up using them in the test, then I think this is a more robust strategy when preparing for your IELTS. If you are more interested in learning words like those, that's what I put in the ebook IELTS Speaking Secrets, so check it out. Last but not least, I'm going to reveal the 5th word, which is insight. And this is a C1 word, and an insight means sort of like an understanding or a sudden realization of something. So when I say I have some insights, it means that I got some sudden realization or understanding of how things work. It just like you get a different perspective basically in your mind. In part 1, if you are talking about reading books, you could say, I love reading books. I find them very insightful, because you're always going to learn something new from reading a good book. In part 2, when you are describing a person, you could also say the same thing, and you could say, she is incredibly insightful. So she helps you understand things or teaches you new concepts. In part 3, the examiner might ask you, do you think critical thinking is important? And you could say, absolutely. Critical thinking allows you to be more insightful or provide a more insightful analysis or understand things in a better way.